80 years ago, I penned a warning that most dismissed as alarmist. Today, watching governments expand their reach under the guise of public health, climate urgency, and social justice, I see my predictions materializing with unsettling precision. The erosion of constitutional limits, the growth of administrative states, and the willingness to sacrifice individual liberty for collective security follow the exact trajectory I outlined in The Road to Serfdom. What began as emergency measures become permanent features of governance. What started as noble intentions to help society becomes the machinery of control. The crisis we face today is not merely political, it is epistemological. We have forgotten the fundamental truth that human knowledge is limited, that no group of experts can possess the information necessary to direct society, and that freedom is not a luxury but the essential condition for discovering solutions to our complex challenges. Chapter 1: The Intellectual Error That Enables Tyranny. The path to serfdom begins not with malicious intent, but with a fatal intellectual error, the belief that human reason can design and control complex social systems. This hubris, which I termed the fatal conceit, pervades contemporary policy discussions. Politicians promise to build back better, technocrats claim they can follow the science, and bureaucrats insist they can manage entire economies through regulation. What these well-intentioned planners fail to grasp is the fundamental limitation of human knowledge. No individual, no committee, no computer algorithm can possibly comprehend the billions of preferences, constraints, and local circumstances that must be coordinated for society to function. The knowledge required for social coordination is not the kind found in textbooks or databases. It is the practical, contextual, ever-changing knowledge possessed by millions of individuals about their particular circumstances, their needs, their capabilities, their local conditions. Consider how quickly government responses to the pandemic revealed this knowledge problem. Bureaucrats in distant capitals made blanket rules for vastly different communities, ignoring local conditions, individual circumstances, and the crucial trade-offs that only people on the ground could understand. The result was not just economic devastation, but a profound demonstration of why central planning, however benevolent its intentions, cannot substitute for the dispersed intelligence of free individuals making their own decisions. This intellectual error becomes dangerous when combined with the seductive promise of scientific management. The appeal to expertise and evidence-based policy sounds reasonable, but it masks a fundamental category error. The methods that work in natural sciences, where variables can be controlled and experiments repeated, cannot be applied to complex social phenomena where human action and cultural evolution create emergent properties that no scientific method can predict or control. The tragic irony is that this faith in planned solutions grows stronger precisely when problems become more complex and urgent. Climate change, inequality, technological disruption, each crisis becomes a justification for more centralized control, more expert management, more restrictions on individual choice. Yet these are exactly the challenges that require the distributed problem-solving capacity that only freedom can unleash. Chapter 2: How Emergency Powers Become Permanent Chains. History reveals a consistent pattern. Temporary emergency measures become permanent features of government power. What I observed during the wartime economies of the 1940s has played out repeatedly in subsequent decades. Each crisis, whether war, recession, pandemic, or environmental threat, provides the justification for expanding state control over individual decisions. The mechanism is always the same. First comes the identification of an urgent problem requiring immediate action. Then follows the argument that normal constitutional processes are too slow, too cumbersome, too democratic to address the crisis effectively. Emergency powers are granted, ostensibly temporary, with promises of return to normalcy once the crisis passes. But crises have a way of never truly ending, and the expanded powers prove remarkably persistent. Consider the evolution of the American administrative state since the New Deal. What began as temporary responses to economic depression became permanent bureaucratic agencies with rulemaking authority that bypasses Congress. The Federal Register, which records federal regulations, has grown from a few hundred pages annually to over 80,000 pages. Each rule represents a restriction on individual choice, a transfer of decision-making authority from private citizens to government officials. The pattern accelerated dramatically during recent years. Public health emergencies justified restrictions on movement, association, and economic activity that would have been unthinkable just decades ago. The speed with which democratic societies accepted these limitations revealed how fragile constitutional protections become when fear motivates policy. Emergency use authorizations, lockdown orders, and vaccine mandates established precedents for government control over the most intimate aspects of human life. Even more troubling is how these emergency powers migrate across policy domains. Techniques developed for pandemic response, digital tracking, movement restrictions, business closures, are now proposed for climate policy. The infrastructure of control, once established, finds new applications. The legal precedents, once set, justify future expansions. The economic disruptions caused by emergency measures then create new justifications for intervention. Business failures require bailouts. Unemployment necessitates expanded welfare. Supply chain disruptions demand industrial policy. Each government response to the problems created by previous interventions becomes evidence of the need for more comprehensive planning. This ratchet effect operates because the costs of government control are diffuse and delayed, while the benefits appear immediate and concentrated. Politicians gain credit for doing something about visible problems, while the invisible costs, the innovations prevented, the choices foreclosed, the spontaneous solutions that never emerge, remain hidden from public view. Chapter 3: The Digital Panopticon and Modern Surveillance. The technological revolution has provided governments with surveillance capabilities that would have made Orwell's Big Brother envious. Digital communications, financial transactions, location tracking, and social media activity create an unprecedented record of human behavior. What concerns me most is not just the existence of this surveillance infrastructure, but how readily free societies have accepted its expansion. The knowledge problem I identified 8 decades ago takes on new dimensions in the digital age. Governments now possess vast quantities of data about individual behavior, leading to the dangerous illusion that they can predict and control social outcomes with scientific precision. Algorithmic decision-making in everything from criminal justice to economic policy creates the appearance of objective, rational administration while actually embedding the biases and limitations of their programmers. Consider how digital contact tracing during health emergencies normalized the idea that government should monitor individual movements and associations. Apps that tracked location data, databases that recorded vaccine status, and digital passports that controlled access to public spaces established infrastructure for comprehensive social control. The temporary justification of public health masked the permanent expansion of surveillance capability. The integration of artificial intelligence into government operations amplifies these concerns. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns in human behavior that enable predictive policing, social credit systems, and personalized propaganda. The Chinese social credit system represents the logical endpoint of this trajectory, a society where artificial intelligence monitors every transaction, every movement, every social interaction to generate compliance scores that determine access to employment, travel, and social services. Western democracies have not yet embraced such comprehensive systems, but the building blocks are already in place. Financial surveillance through banking regulations allows governments to monitor and control economic activity. Social media platforms cooperate with authorities to identify and suppress misinformation. Employment increasingly requires proof of compliance with ever-expanding government mandates. The danger lies not just in current applications, but in the precedents being established. Each expansion of digital surveillance creates infrastructure that future governments can exploit. Each new database becomes a tool for social control. Each algorithm that influences individual choice represents a step away from spontaneous order toward engineered society. The irony is that this surveillance apparatus, supposedly designed to enhance security and efficiency, actually undermines the very conditions necessary for social progress. Innovation requires experimentation, entrepreneurship demands risk-taking, and cultural evolution needs diversity of thought and action. A society under comprehensive surveillance inevitably becomes more conformist, more risk-averse, and less capable of adapting to changing circumstances. Chapter 4: The Economics of Control: How Good Intentions Create Bad Outcomes. The most seductive aspect of central planning is its appeal to moral sentiment. Who could oppose policies designed to help the poor, protect the environment, or ensure public health? The tragedy is that these noble intentions, when implemented through government control, systematically produce outcomes opposite to those intended. This occurs because political processes operate according to different incentives and information flows than market processes. Politicians respond to visible constituencies and immediate problems, not to the complex, long-term consequences of their actions. Bureaucrats optimize for measurable outcomes and risk avoidance, not for innovation and adaptation. Interest groups capture regulatory processes to benefit themselves at the expense of the broader public. Consider minimum wage laws, ostensibly designed to help low-skilled workers. The immediate, visible effect is higher wages for those who keep their jobs. The invisible effects, reduced employment opportunities, increased automation, barriers to entry for new businesses, hurt precisely the people the policy was meant to help. Yet because these costs are dispersed and delayed, while the benefits appear immediate and concentrated, the policy maintains political support despite its counterproductive effects. Environmental regulation provides another illustration. Command and control approaches that mandate specific technologies or ban particular activities create rigid systems that cannot adapt to changing circumstances or new information. Innovation gets channeled into complying with regulations rather than solving underlying problems. Entrepreneurs who might develop breakthrough technologies face regulatory barriers that protect established interests. The COVID-19 response demonstrated these dynamics on a massive scale. Lockdowns that destroyed small businesses while protecting large corporations. School closures that harmed children's development while teachers' unions maintained their political influence. Supply chain disruptions caused by rigid regulations that prevented flexible adaptation to changing circumstances. Each policy failure then becomes justification for more intervention. When minimum wage laws increase unemployment, politicians propose job training programs. When environmental regulations stifle innovation, bureaucrats create subsidy programs. When lockdowns damage mental health, governments expand healthcare budgets. The original problem persists or worsens, but the political system responds by doing more of what caused the problem in the first place. This dynamic is particularly destructive in complex, rapidly changing domains like technology and healthcare. Regulatory agencies cannot possibly keep pace with innovation, so they default to banning new approaches until they can be thoroughly studied. The precautionary principle, seemingly prudent, actually prevents the experimentation and risk-taking that produces genuine solutions. The alternative, allowing spontaneous order to operate through market mechanisms, appears chaotic and uncontrolled to planners. Yet this apparent chaos is actually a sophisticated coordination mechanism that processes information and adapts to changing circumstances far more effectively than any centralized system could achieve. Chapter 5: Constitutional Safeguards and Their Systematic Erosion. The American constitutional system was designed with profound understanding of the dangers I later articulated in my work. The separation of powers, federalism, and individual rights were not merely political compromises, they were institutional innovations designed to prevent the concentration of power that inevitably leads to tyranny. Yet these safeguards have been systematically eroded through techniques that bypass their intended constraints. The growth of the administrative state represents perhaps the most significant constitutional development of the past century. Agencies that combine legislative, executive, and judicial functions in single institutions violate the fundamental principle of separated powers. When the Environmental Protection Agency writes regulations, enforces them, and adjudicates disputes about their application, it exercises all three governmental functions without the checks and balances the founders intended. Congressional delegation of legislative authority to executive agencies has accelerated this process. Rather than making difficult policy choices themselves, legislators pass vague statutes that grant broad authority to bureaucrats. This allows politicians to claim credit for addressing problems while avoiding responsibility for the specific costs and trade-offs their policies create. The result is government by unelected experts who are insulated from democratic accountability. Federal preemption of state authority has similarly undermined the laboratory of democracy that federalism was meant to create. When Washington mandates uniform policies across all 50 states, it prevents the experimentation and competition between different approaches that federalism enables. States cannot discover better solutions when federal law prevents them from trying alternative policies. The erosion of constitutional protections accelerates during emergencies when normal procedural safeguards are suspended in the name of urgent necessity. The expansion of executive power during wartime rarely contracts to pre-war levels once peace returns. Each crisis establishes precedents for future expansions of government authority. Judicial deference to administrative expertise has compounded these problems. Courts that once viewed their role as enforcing constitutional limits increasingly defer to agency interpretations of their own authority. The Chevron doctrine, which requires courts to defer to reasonable agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes, effectively allows bureaucrats to expand their own power without meaningful judicial oversight. The result is a system where constitutional limits become increasingly meaningless in practice. Individual rights that appear secure in theory prove fragile when confronted with determined government action justified by expert opinion and emergency necessity. Property rights yield to environmental regulations. Freedom of association succumbs to anti-discrimination mandates. Economic liberty disappears under the weight of comprehensive regulation. This constitutional erosion is not the result of dramatic institutional changes but of gradual shifts in interpretation and practice that accumulate over time. Each small expansion of government authority creates precedent for the next. Each new emergency provides justification for further centralization. Each expert claim of superior knowledge undermines confidence in democratic decision-making. Chapter 6: Market Solutions versus Political Solutions, the Information Advantage. The fundamental advantage of market processes over political processes lies in their superior ability to discover and utilize dispersed information. Markets coordinate the actions of millions of individuals who each possess unique knowledge about their circumstances, preferences, and capabilities. No central planner can possibly access this information, yet market prices aggregate it automatically and continuously. Consider how markets responded to pandemic disruptions compared to government planning. While bureaucrats struggled to manage supply chains through regulations and mandates, entrepreneurs rapidly pivoted to producing hand sanitizer, masks, and medical equipment. Restaurants shifted to delivery and outdoor dining. Workers adapted to remote employment. Consumers changed their purchasing patterns. These adjustments happened spontaneously, without central coordination, because price signals and profit incentives directed resources toward their most valued uses. The contrast with government responses is instructive. Political processes are designed to build consensus around predetermined solutions, not to discover new approaches through experimentation. Legislative procedures require extensive deliberation and compromise, making rapid adaptation impossible. Bureaucratic agencies operate according to established rules and procedures that resist innovation. The result is rigid, one-size-fits-all policies that cannot adapt to local circumstances or changing conditions. This information advantage becomes even more important as societies become more complex and specialized. The knowledge required for modern economic coordination is increasingly technical, local, and tacit. A farmer knows soil conditions that no agricultural expert in Washington can understand. A small business owner understands customer preferences that no market research can capture. A worker knows his own skills and circumstances better than any employment counselor. Markets harness this distributed knowledge through voluntary exchange. When individuals trade freely, they reveal information about their preferences and constraints through their choices. Prices emerge from these voluntary exchanges, providing signals that guide production and consumption decisions throughout the economy. Profit and loss provide feedback that directs resources away from unsuccessful ventures toward more valuable alternatives. Political processes, by contrast, aggregate preferences through voting and lobbying, which provide much cruder signals about what people value. A vote for a candidate or party bundles together many different policy positions, making it impossible to determine which specific policies voters actually support. Interest group influence distorts these signals further, as well-organized minorities can capture regulatory processes at the expense of diffuse majorities. The knowledge problem becomes particularly acute in technology policy, where the pace of innovation far exceeds the capacity of regulatory systems to understand and respond appropriately. By the time bureaucrats develop rules for new technologies, the technologies have already evolved in directions the rules didn't anticipate. Meanwhile, the regulatory uncertainty discourages the very experimentation that produces breakthrough innovations. Cryptocurrency provides a perfect example. Decentralized digital currencies emerged from voluntary experimentation by programmers and entrepreneurs, not from government planning. The complex technical challenges of creating secure, scalable payment systems were solved through market processes, not bureaucratic mandates. Yet governments now struggle to regulate technologies they don't understand, often threatening to ban innovations that could provide enormous benefits. Chapter 7: Reclaiming Liberty: Practical Steps for Restoration. The crisis of liberty we face today is not inevitable. Throughout history, societies have rediscovered the principles of limited government and individual freedom after periods of collectivist excess. The key is understanding that freedom is not merely the absence of government control, but the presence of institutions that protect individual choice and spontaneous order. Constitutional restoration must begin with reviving the separation of powers that has been eroded by the administrative state. Congress should reclaim its legislative authority by writing specific laws rather than delegating broad rulemaking power to agencies. Courts should abandon deference doctrines that allow bureaucrats to interpret their own authority. Executive agencies should be restructured to separate their regulatory, enforcement, and adjudicative functions. Federalism offers another avenue for restoring constitutional limits. States should reassert their authority to experiment with different policy approaches rather than accepting federal mandates. Interstate compacts can enable cooperation without centralization. Local governments should resist unfunded mandates and assert their right to self-governance within constitutional limits. The digital revolution creates new opportunities for spontaneous order that can bypass traditional government controls. Cryptocurrency enables peer-to-peer transactions without government intermediation. Blockchain technologies can create transparent, tamper-proof records without central authorities. Decentralized platforms can facilitate communication and commerce without corporate or government censorship. Educational reform is essential for rebuilding understanding of constitutional principles and economic reality. Students should learn how markets coordinate complex activities without central planning. Civic education should emphasize the importance of individual rights and limited government. Economic literacy should include understanding of how prices communicate information and coordinate production. The private sector can accelerate this process by embracing voluntary standards and self-regulation rather than relying on government mandates. Industry associations can develop codes of conduct that protect consumers without stifling innovation. Professional certification can provide quality assurance without regulatory barriers to entry. Private arbitration can resolve disputes more efficiently than court systems. Technology companies have particular responsibility to resist government pressure for censorship and surveillance. Encryption technologies should be strengthened, not weakened. Privacy protections should be enhanced, not compromised. Platform algorithms should promote viewpoint diversity, not political conformity. Citizens must actively resist the expansion of government control by refusing to comply with unconstitutional mandates and supporting businesses that prioritize freedom over political correctness. Civil disobedience, when practiced peacefully and purposefully, can delegitimize unjust laws and inspire broader resistance. The intellectual battle is equally important. We must challenge the assumptions that justify government planning, that experts know better than individuals, that good intentions guarantee good outcomes, that complex problems require centralized solutions. We must demonstrate through theory and evidence that spontaneous order produces better results than conscious design, that individual liberty enhances rather than threatens social cooperation, and that constitutional limits protect rather than impede human flourishing. Conclusion. The crisis of liberty we face today validates the warnings I issued 8 decades ago, but it also demonstrates the resilience of human creativity and the power of spontaneous order. Even under the most restrictive government controls, entrepreneurs find ways to serve customers, innovators develop new technologies, and communities organize voluntary cooperation. Freedom is not just a political ideal, it is a practical necessity for solving the complex challenges of modern society. The choice before us is clear: we can continue down the road to serfdom, accepting ever greater government control in exchange for promises of security and prosperity that central planning cannot deliver. Or we can rediscover the wisdom embedded in constitutional limits, market processes, and individual responsibility. The outcome depends not on the decisions of political leaders, but on whether ordinary citizens understand and defend the principles that make free societies possible. The future of liberty rests in your hands.